Hello again, guys. We're ready to move on with the Palaces of Westminster. This is the seat of London and England's UK Parliament, and it's designed according to some pretty specific needs for a burgeoning government or a structure. So we're going to take a look at that here in a second. I'll remove this face here and show you a little bit more about what you need to know in regards to this piece of very romantic architecture. Well, the last piece of architecture that we looked at, guys, was Monticello. And if you remember from our discussion, we used the word neoclassicism to talk about its design. It is a balanced facade that really gives a nod to the basics of democratic architecture. We see references to Rome. We see reference to ancient Greece. Even though we're using indigenous local materials of brick and wood, still the idea is present there that this is to be a balanced and unified plan designed for enshrining democratic ideals for which it was designed. If this is neoclassicism, then I would have to say that this is definitely a nod toward romantic architecture. Art historians and architecture historians basically refer to this era in history as the era of historicism. And that is just a fancy way of saying looking back to the past for romantic notions of national identity. Whether or not it was true, whether or not it was strong for the people, you're going to find there are lots of architects who are getting commissions recreating a glorified past that is more in keeping with national character. And that's what the Palace of Westminster is. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about it. I wanted to show you J.M.W. Turner's very powerful landscape. It's called The Burning of the Houses of Parliament. And this is the scene as it played out in 1834. From the video and from the article, you guys know that this structure we see today is not the original structure. There was a catastrophic fire. It started with a small fire in the basement and then spread to the entirety of the building. Only a small fraction of the original Parliament survives today in Westminster Hall. And in Turner's version of it here, you can see the towers of Westminster Abbey just behind the intensity of that heat, and fire, with lots of people gathered on the Thames on the opposite side of the river to watch it fall to pieces. So this was a catastrophic event. About 40 years later, the new Parliament will be standing. But during that time, there's a real search for what will be identified as true British character and architecture. Now, the decision is ultimately made to go with the perpendicular Gothic style, which is very different than the Gothic that we've looked at before in France. The French had always identified height as a real aim in creating these almost virtual cities of God as churches for the faithful to worship in. British character had never really picked up on that vein and had kept more of a fortified square tower approach, with churches in the Romanesque and the Gothic in England and London much less tall. They were basically not ever made to be as tall as their Gothic counterparts in France. Over the crossing towers, you would always see these square fortified towers at the front of the Westworks, same thing. So you can kind of see why the design of Parliament and why the design of the Palaces of Westminster really gives a nod to these older styles that were more in keeping with British character. It's kind of interesting. For a while, this had not been seen in London. The fashion for architecture in the 1600s and right around the 1700s had been to go with a more Italian style that looked a little bit more like the mannerism we were seeing of Palladio. A similar fire here in 1666 caused the redesign of the largest church in the Anglican Church, St. Paul's. And it was a bit of a shock and a bit of a surprise to see a domed structure like this with undulating towers that seemed more Italian than English. The original structure at St. Paul's had also had a square tower over the crossing, and that was the plan for putting a new church into place. The story goes that Wren changed the design at the last minute because he knew there would be a lot of protest against making something look like St. Peter's in Rome, when England is actually an Anglican country. But his will persists, and what we get for a while in London is a series of buildings that look more and more Italian than actually English. But of course, this is an icon of the city today, and it's one of the buildings that survives the World War II Battle of the Blitz, or Battle for London. Battle for Britain, and it's a national patriotic site, of course, today. But at the time of the fire of the palaces of Westminster, it was seen as something that really wasn't true to proper English character. So lamented at that time too was this is the second wave of the Industrial Revolution. And people who had come in the first wave to cottages and cities all over London were now finding themselves further urbanized in large industry centers that didn't look like the Gothic world of church spires. It's beginning to look a little bit more like the industrialist world of factory chimneys. With that burgeoning industrialism, people felt they were losing a connection to the past, and this seemed to be the prime opportunity to reconnect. John Constable was doing the same kind of thing with a lot of his landscapes that memorialized man's relationship to nature as being something that was poignant, something that should be maintained as ideal. Here we see Salisbury Cathedral in a perfect green glen off in the distance, kind of a throwback to when man lived at harmony with nature and its surroundings. So this is a time to basically re-examine that idea. Of course, what you're looking at here, this is the facade of Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey survives the fire and has been on that site since the time of the Norman Conquest. A version of the church has been there since the time of the Norman Conquest, and this kind of Gothic architecture, Gothic vocabulary sprung up as kind of an example. So it's important that you know this is probably what inspired the design of Palaces of Westminster more than anything, because it sits literally right across the street from the structure. This is the palace, or the chapel, I should say, of Henry VII that was put here by the King Henry VIII for his father as a memorial. And that heavily decorated fan vaulting that we're seeing inside the chapel will provide some inspiration as well. If you take a look at Westminster Hall, you guys can see the ornate woodwork that was added to the roof structure. This is the one part of Palaces of Westminster that survived the fire and had been the site of coronations, had been the site of banquets that were celebrated in honor of coronations. It was the one place strategically where all three parts of the government could coexist in the same space at one time. So a massive effort was put underway to kind of preserve it from the fire, and it was seen as a victory. Essentially giving some of its inspiration to the redesign. Now, in this slide, you guys can see how close the two are. You'll notice there's just a slight difference in color. Houses of Parliament, they decided to bring in limestone from the city of Bath because that was seen as an austere kind of stone to be using. But basically what we have is a reinterpretation of Westminster Abbey and encoded into the design of a very modern building. Even though it looks primarily like a Gothic revival, the structure itself is not completely stone. It uses modern materials and has what we call a Gothic veneer. So don't make the mistake of assuming they went back to the old building methods to reconstruct this Palace of Westminster. Okay, here are your architects, and this will give you a pretty good indication of who is basically leading the structural design and who is leading the surface ornamentation, right? Charles Barry is depicted here with his compass and modern materials used for architecture, while Pugin is here depicted in front of a tapestry that has a family crest in a much more medieval kind of setting. So you can see right away, Charles Barry's going to build the structure of the building to be a bit more like a classical building using modern materials, while Pugin is going to decorate it in perpendicular Gothic. There is Westminster Hall. You can see how close it is to the Houses of Parliament today and that it survived the fire. But that is the only part of the building that's actually true to the original Houses of Parliament. If you take a look, I want to show you the floor plan, because I think once you understand how this thing is arranged, then you're going to see that it's ideally suited for a constitutional monarchy, because it has a place for all parts of government to be. So let's move ahead here to the floor plan. The things that I think you need to remember. Number one, the Victoria Tower. That is the royal monarch's entrance to the structure. And just behind it, you'll see a king's robing room, a royal gallery of portraits of monarchs, and then you'll see the chambers that lead right into the House of Lords. That's where the monarch sits. So that Victoria Tower marks essentially the entry for the royal that is part of this government. You see Westminster Hall there on the floor plan. You also see the Central Hall. The Central Hall is the chamber that combines the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And it's actually quite a modern structure. It looks like an old Gothic spire, but it's meant to be like the breathing lung of the building, letting air circulate inside a very large complex. I think, no pun intended, a lot of hot air is going to be exchanged between the chambers, and this gives it a chance to escape before causing any damage, right? There is the Elizabeth Tower, guys. That is the tower that houses the big, big bell known as Big Ben. It's also features a clock that's pretty iconic for the city. Most people make their way to Elizabeth Tower, take a picture, and then know that they're in London, obviously. If you take a look, that's the monarch's platform here in the House of Lords. When the Queen starts a session of Parliament, this is where she speaks from. She's able to see all the way through to the House of Commons, which is just on the other side of Central Hall, and it unifies the government in kind of a metaphor for what constitutional monarchy should be. So if you're thinking about our American form of government and you think about the design of the Capitol, we have the Senate on one side of the rotunda, and we have the House of Representatives on the other. Well, this is in similar fashion set up that way to represent essentially what the British monarchy is all about. So I think it's ideally suited for what it needs to do. When you take a look at the central lobby, you can see it looks like it's like the oldest part of the building, right? But it actually is a more modern structure designed to provide that ventilation, which was so valuable. Overall, I think it's important for you to remember that it's this chapel, the Henry VII chapel, right across the street, that informs the surface texture and design of the building. So that will be helpful for you when it's time to talk about influences and perhaps justify why we call this romantic architecture.